At exactly 2:15 a.m. on December 18, 2025, the night over the Kerch Strait ruptured into light heat and confusion as a Russian rail convoy advertised as a Christmas peace train vanished in a fireball visible far beyond Crimea. What Russian state media framed as humanitarian aid was in reality a moving magazine, hundreds of tons of ammunition and rocket propellant compressed onto a single railway spine, connecting occupied Crimea to Russia's southern logistics network. The explosion was not random, and it was not luck. It was the final second of a sequence that had begun long before the first flame broke the darkness. 15 minutes earlier, Ukrainian operators were already watching the bridge through layered intelligence feeds. Satellite imagery had raised the first red flag railcar suspensions pressed to their mechanical limits, a sign of weight inconsistent with relief supplies. Thermal sensors confirmed it. Abnormal heat blooming from inside sealed wagons, the unmistakable signature of solid rocket fuel. Western analysts later noted that such thermal anomalies are nearly impossible to hide even with insulated casings, especially when a train is moving at speed through freezing night air. The train was a decoy only in name. The strategic value of that convoy was enormous. According to Western defense estimates, the cargo represented enough artillery shells, rockets, and drone components to sustain Russian offensive operations along at least one frontline axis for weeks. At a moment when Ukraine had already intensified strikes on Russian refineries, fuel depots, and power substations deep behind the front, losing a concentrated logistics payload was more damaging than losing a single ship or aircraft. This was not about symbolism, it was about throughput. Russian commanders, however, believed the Kerch Bridge had been transformed into a fortress. Since earlier strikes embarrassed Moscow and forced temporary closures, the bridge had been layered with Pantsir systems on elevated towers overlapping S-400 coverage from the Crimean coast patrol boats beneath the spans, and heavy electronic warfare designed to suffocate drones before they reached visual range. Billions of dollars in air defense and jamming hardware stood guard over 11 miles of concrete and steel. The assumption was simple saturation attacks could be stopped, and single threats could be swatted aside. That confidence shaped the opening moments of the engagement. When Russian sensors detected what appeared to be a small, isolated contact, approaching low over-the-water operators interpreted it as yet another probing drone, an irritation, not a crisis. What they did not see was the broader choreography unfolding beyond radar focus, a sequence designed not to punch through defenses head-on, but to exhaust them psychologically, electronically, and economically. This was the deeper logic behind the strike. Ukraine did not need to destroy the bridge outright to achieve strategic effect. Disrupting rail traffic, forcing inspections, and incinerating irreplaceable cargo would be enough to slow Russian operations and force Moscow into costly defensive overreactions. NATO analysts have repeatedly emphasized that modern warfare increasingly favors systems disruption over spectacle, and what unfolded over Kerch would soon become a textbook example. As the first contacts drew Russian attention downward toward the waterline, unseen assets were already moving into position above and beyond the defensive envelope, waiting not for a gap, but for a moment of overconfidence. And that moment was only seconds away. What followed next was not an attempt to overpower Russian defenses, but to engineer the illusion of success. At 2:04 a.m., Russian radar operators detected a large, unmistakable signature climbing aggressively into their engagement envelope. It looked exactly like what Moscow had trained for a high-value Ukrainian drone platform, exposing itself too boldly, too predictably. The contact was soon identified as a heavy, unmanned aircraft, large heat signature, steady climb, classic target. Russian crews reacted with confidence. Orders moved smoothly down the chain of command. Target prioritization software flagged the aircraft as a mothership, precisely the kind of asset Russian doctrine emphasizes destroying early. In theory, killing the carrier would collapse any accompanying swarm. In practice, that assumption had already been baked into Ukraine's plan. As the drone climbed to roughly 1,000 feet, it deliberately crossed into clear radar visibility, triggering tracking locks from multiple Pantsir fire control systems. Moments later, the sky appeared to fracture. The aircraft released a cloud of smaller drones, cheap expendable platforms fitted with radar reflectors and programmed for erratic flight. To Russian sensors, one target instantly became 13, each moving at different speeds and altitudes. The system read it as a saturation attack. This was the psychological pivot. Russian commanders knew they were being tested, but not how. Believing they were seeing the main effort, they committed interceptor missiles early. A Panzer unit launched a high-speed missile toward the mothership, accelerating to several times the speed of sound. On Ukrainian operator screens, warning indicators flashed. There was no expectation that the carrier would survive a direct hit. It did not have to. In a moment that Western analysts later described as probabilistic brilliance, one of the decoy drones drifted into the missile's path. The proximity fuse detonated early, shredding the decoy and showering fragments across the larger drone's fuselage. Damaged but functional, the carrier dropped altitude, sharply slipping beneath radar coverage and limping away. From the Russian perspective, the outcome still looked positive. The carrier had fled. The sky was full of targets. Defenses were holding. That perception mattered more than the physical result. Within seconds, Russian air defense crews escalated to full auto-engagement. Cannons, missiles, and electronic warfare systems operated simultaneously, each reinforcing the belief that the attack was being defeated. Ammunition counters fell rapidly. Missile rails emptied. Barrels overheated. The engagement tempo surged beyond peacetime assumptions. Meanwhile, Ukrainian planners were achieving their real objective, forcing Russian defenses to burn through interceptors and attention. Each missile fired at a decoy was a missile unavailable later. Each radar locked onto false targets was a radar not scanning elsewhere. NATO officers would later describe this phase as defensive depletion under perceived victory, a dangerous psychological state where operators feel in control while unknowingly approaching critical limits. Economically, the imbalance was stark. Open-source estimates suggest each interceptor launch during these minutes cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, while the decoys they destroyed were worth a fraction of that. In modern warfare, cost asymmetry is not an afterthought. It is a weapon. As smoke from destroyed drones drifted across the strait, thermal imagery degraded, further reducing situational clarity. To Russian crews, the engagement appeared to be winding down successfully. The swarm was thinning. The threat seemed neutralized. Celebratory language crept into command channels. But the illusion was complete and dangerous. Because while Russian defenses were busy congratulating themselves on a clean interception record, the actual strike package had not yet revealed itself. It was still running dark, skimming low, waiting for silence rather than chaos. And that silence was now approaching fast. At 2:05 a.m., the battlefield shifted from spectacle to vulnerability. Russian air defense systems, flushed with apparent success, were now operating at their most dangerous point, not overwhelmed but partially blind. Missile inventories were low. Autocannon barrels glowed from sustained fire, and electronic warfare units pushed to maximum output were saturating the spectrum with enough noise to drown out civilian communications across Crimea. From the Russian perspective, this was strength. From a systems perspective, it was self-inflicted blindness. Western electronic warfare specialists later noted a critical flaw in this posture. High-power jamming does not discriminate. When pushed beyond optimal thresholds, it degrades not only hostile signals, but friendly coordination, sensor fusion, and targeting feedback loops. In simple terms, Russian operators had turned their own defenses into isolated islands, each system screaming into the void, none seeing clearly. That was the opening Ukraine had been waiting for. As radar screens whitened with interference and drifting smoke, a second unmanned platform slipped through the defensive seam. Unlike the earlier decoy carrier, this drone flew dark, low-altitude, minimal emissions, hugging the sea surface where radar curvature and clutter worked in its favor. It did not provoke locks. It did not climb. It did not announce itself. It simply waited for the defenders to exhaust themselves. At the same moment, Russian commanders faced a new alert, a high-speed inbound contact from the northwest moving just below the horizon. The signature suggested a cruise missile. With Panzer units depleted, the task fell to long-range systems on the Crimean coast. An S-400 battery engaged and scored what appeared to be a textbook intercept. For the third time that night, Russian crews celebrated, but this interception behaved differently. Instead of a clean dissipation, the explosion expanded into a dense cloud that rolled across the bridge deck, carried by strong coastal winds. The payload was not optimized for blast, but for obscuration, a mix of metallic chaff and aerosolized particles engineered to blind radar and thermal sensors simultaneously. Screens that were already noisy went completely opaque. For several minutes, one of the most heavily defended pieces of infrastructure in Europe was effectively invisible to itself. This was not improvisation. Western analysts have pointed out that such multispectral obscurants have been discussed in NATO doctrine for years, precisely because they exploit the increasing reliance on sensor fusion. When every system feeds the same corrupted picture, redundancy becomes fragility. Behind this artificial fog, the real strike asset moved into position. Onboard optical systems immune to radar jamming began resolving the bridge through thinning smoke. The target was unmistakable. Railcars glowing with internal heat signatures rolled steadily eastward, unaware that every defensive layer above them had just been peeled away. This was the moment Ukraine had engineered not a breach through firepower, but a pause in perception. The broader strategic implications were immediate. NATO observers would later note that this phase demonstrated how layered air defense can fail not by collapse, but by over-performance systems working so aggressively that they consume their own effectiveness. For Western militaries watching closely, Kerch was less a warning than a case study. As the obscurant cloud drifted and Russian crews struggled to re-establish visual clarity, the unseen drone opened its internal bay. The final act was no longer about deception. It was about precision. And the train, still moving confidently across the span, was seconds away from learning the difference between protection and vulnerability. By the time Russian operators realized their screens were lying to them, the engagement had already shifted irreversibly. Inside the obscured airspace above the bridge, Ukrainian sensors locked onto the true objective, not the span itself, but the train rolling across it. This distinction mattered. Destroying the bridge would have been dramatic, but strategically blunt. Destroying the cargo was surgical deniable and far more damaging to Russian warfighting capacity. Western logistics analysts have repeatedly emphasized that Russia's southern front is constrained not by manpower, but by throughput. Ammunition, fuel, and drones must cross a small number of hardened corridors. The Kerch rail line is the most efficient of them all. According to European defense estimates, rail transport across the bridge moves the equivalent of hundreds of truckloads per day. Every uninterrupted crossing sustains pressure on Ukrainian lines. Every disruption compounds shortages already aggravated by Ukrainian strikes on refineries and power nodes inside Russia. Through optical feeds, Ukrainian operators could now see what satellites had hinted at earlier. Cars in the middle of the convoy glowed hotter than the rest, heat bleeding through steel walls despite cold sea air. Analysts would later confirm that such signatures align with solid rocket motors and packed artillery rounds, both notoriously sensitive to heat and shock. This was not a symbolic target. It was a rolling vulnerability. The drone released its first wave. Small, fast attack drones dropped cleanly and accelerated toward the train, deliberately exposing themselves. Russian guards aboard the convoy reacted immediately, opening fire from doorways and platforms. Tracer rounds arced into the darkness. Several drones were destroyed before reaching their targets. From the Russian perspective, this looked like containment, a limited attack being beaten back at close range. But again, that perception was part of the design. As defenders focused forward and downward, a second set of drones detached from the carrier above. These were not remotely piloted in the traditional sense. Once released, they severed active data links, relying instead on onboard processing and preloaded target profiles. Jamming, which moments earlier had blinded Russian systems, now worked in Ukraine's favor. There was nothing left to disrupt. The drones adjusted their approach angles autonomously, climbing sharply to clear protective nets strung along the bridge. This maneuver, described by Western engineers as pop-up evasion, exploited the fact that most physical countermeasures are optimized for horizontal threats. From above, the train had little protection. Gravity did the rest. Within seconds, multiple drones dove onto the same cluster of railcars. The first impact breached a roof panel and triggered a shape-charged jet capable of piercing armor. Inside, stacked munitions detonated sympathetically. The explosion did not vent outward immediately. It expanded internally, amplifying pressure until the car's structure failed catastrophically. The effect cascaded. Adjacent cars derailed as shockwaves traveled along the rails. Rocket motors ignited rather than exploded, turning into uncontrolled engines that spun and sprayed burning propellant across the deck. Temperatures climbed rapidly, hot enough to soften steel and compromise rail integrity. Surveillance feeds cut out as cameras overheated or melted outright. From a strategic standpoint, this was the nightmare scenario Russian planners had tried to prevent. Not a collapsed bridge, but a functional bridge, rendered unusable by heat damage, twisted rails, and fused wreckage. Repair timelines stretched from days into months. Rail traffic halted immediately. As flames consumed the convoy, the scale of the loss became clear. Hundreds of tons of ammunition enough to sustain sustained operations along a major front were gone in minutes. The bridge still stood, but the logistical artery it supported had been severed. And for Moscow, the realization was only beginning to settle in. As the firestorm raged across the railspan, the immediate spectacle masked a deeper, more consequential reality. The Kerch strike was not just destruction, it was denial. Russian emergency crews would later describe arriving to a scene that looked structurally intact from a distance, yet was functionally ruined. Steel rails had warped under extreme heat. Concrete surfaces had spalled and cracked, and twisted rail cars were fused into the bridge deck like molten scars. No train could pass. Not today, not tomorrow. Possibly not for months. Western infrastructure specialists noted that this kind of damage is far harder to repair than a clean collapse. A destroyed span can be rebuilt with modular components. Heat-compromised steel requires painstaking inspection, replacement, and stress testing across long sections. Every hour the bridge remained closed forced Russia to reroute supplies onto ferries and road convoys, slower, more expensive, and vastly more vulnerable to Ukrainian interdiction. The economic asymmetry of the strike quickly became impossible to ignore. Open-source defense analysts estimated Ukraine's total cost, drones, decoys, and support systems at well under a few $100,000. Russia, by contrast, lost a cargo valued in the tens of millions, expended millions more in interceptor missiles, and suffered a logistical disruption whose downstream cost could reach into the billions. In modern warfare, this ratio is not incidental. It is decisive. Military commentators across Europe pointed to this event as another data point in Ukraine's evolving campaign against Russia's war economy. In the weeks leading up to Kerch, Ukrainian forces had struck oil depots, refineries, and power infrastructure deep inside Russian territory, temporarily reducing output and forcing Moscow to dip into reserves. Taken together, these operations form a pattern: degrade production, disrupt transport, and stretch defenses until they become self-defeating. From a NATO perspective, the implications are sobering and instructive. The strike demonstrated that layered air defense, even when technologically advanced, can be manipulated into exhaustion and blindness through deception, timing, and cost pressure. Several Western officers speaking anonymously to defense journals described Kerch as a warning rehearsal, not because NATO faces a similar threat today, but because the same vulnerabilities exist wherever defenses rely on expensive interceptors and centralized sensor fusion. Politically, the message was equally sharp. Moscow had attempted to cloak military logistics in the imagery of humanitarian relief, betting that symbolism would deter attack or complicate attribution. Instead, Ukraine exposed the ruse and turned it against its author. The narrative shifted overnight from Russian control to Russian vulnerability, from deterrence to embarrassment. For Washington and its allies watching from afar under a U.S. administration led by President Donald Trump, the strike reinforced a central strategic debate whether continued support for Ukraine delivers tangible battlefield effects. Events at Kerch offered a clear answer. Precision innovation and intelligence integration were yielding results that conventional force-on-force engagements could not. As dawn broke over the smoldering bridge, Russian planners faced an uncomfortable question: not how to retaliate, but how to move ammunition without becoming the next target. And the answer to that question would shape the next phase of the war. By sunrise, the Kerch Bridge was still standing, but strategically irrelevant. Rail traffic was suspended indefinitely, inspection teams were stalled by residual heat and unexploded ordnance, and Russian logistics officers were already calculating losses that could not be quickly replaced. This was not a one-night disruption. It was a structural shock to Russia's southern supply system, arriving at a moment when pressure along multiple fronts was already intensifying. Western military analysts emphasized that the strike fit a broader Ukrainian pattern. Emerging through late 2025, avoid headline collapses target systemic dependencies. In parallel with the Kerch operation, Ukraine had expanded attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, refineries, storage depots, and electrical substations, forcing Moscow to divert air defenses away from the front and toward domestic protection. Each new layer of defense stretched resources thinner. Each response created new gaps. For NATO planners, the lesson went beyond Ukraine. The Kerch strike demonstrated that modern battlefields are no longer dominated by platform superiority alone, but by decision-making, speed-cost imbalance, and psychological shaping. Russia's defenses did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were coerced into overperformance firing, too much jamming too hard, reacting too confidently. Several Western officers described the event as a case study in defensive saturation without mass attack. Economically, the damage continued to compound. With rail access severed, Russia reverted to ferries and road convoys across the strait, methods slower, costlier, and far easier to target. Insurance premiums rose, transit times lengthened, fuel consumption spiked. What had once been a streamlined artery became a bottleneck under constant threat. The war economy felt it immediately. Politically, the implications reached Washington, Brussels, and beyond. Under a U.S. administration led by President Donald Trump, questions about sustainability, escalation, and burden sharing remain central. Kerch provided a concrete data point. Targeted support, intelligence integration, and adaptive tactics can deliver outsized effects without triggering uncontrolled escalation. For allies watching carefully, it reinforced the value of asymmetric investment over brute force parity. Yet the strike also raised an uncomfortable counter-question. If Ukraine could orchestrate such an operation against one of the most defended structures in Europe, what other nodes, bridges, depots, energy corridors might now be exposed across the wider region? Deterrence, once based on visibility and strength, now had to account for invisibility and patience. As smoke cleared and traffic remained halted, one reality stood out. Moscow had tried to send a message with its so-called Christmas cargo. Ukraine answered with timing, physics, and economics. And the war, far from slowing, had just entered a more calculated and dangerous phase. The Kerch Bridge strike was not about spectacle, it was about systems. Ukraine identified a critical logistics flow, confirmed the deception behind a so-called humanitarian convoy, and dismantled its value through deception, timing, and cost asymmetry. Russian air defenses intercepted every visible threat, yet still lost the battle that mattered. Hundreds of tons of ammunition were destroyed. Rail transport was halted for months, and Russia's southern supply network absorbed a shock far greater than the blast itself. Strategically, the operation reinforced a wider Ukrainian campaign, targeting Russia's war economy, energy transport, and production, while forcing Moscow to overspend on defense. For NATO and the United States, the lesson is clear. Modern warfare increasingly rewards intelligence integration and economic pressure over brute force. Under President Donald Trump's administration, debates over support now hinge less on ideology and more on measurable effect, and Kerch delivered that effect unmistakably. Looking ahead, the key question is escalation management. Will Russia adapt its logistics and defenses, or will each new layer create fresh vulnerabilities? And if you were in command, would you prioritize collapsing infrastructure outright, or continue dismantling it piece by piece as Ukraine has done here? If this analysis helped clarify how modern warfare is evolving, consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dive breakdowns and strategic insights.